Hey guys, good morning. Let's get started. So today is my great pleasure to host Dr. Michelle Mazurek from the University of Maryland College Park. So Michelle is associate professor from the Computer Science Department and the Institute for Advanced Computer Studies at UMD. And she also directs the Maryland Cybersecurity Center. So she has done phenomenal research within human security, which is a very interesting and important area combines cybersecurity and HCI, human-computer interactions. So last year, I was fortunate to attend one of her talk. It was one of the best and mind-changing talk I've ever attended. I'm pretty sure many of you guys will have the same feeling after today's talk. And of course, her research is so impactful that she has won so many awards, including multiple Best Paper Award at top-tier cybersecurity conference, and the NSF Career Award, DARPA Young Faculty Award, and many others. So without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Michelle.
Thank you so much for the really kind introduction. So I'm just getting over a cold, so I'm going to try really hard to project, but like just wave at me from the back or something if I need to talk louder. So, so I'll try. Also, definitely like interrupt me with questions and stuff. This is definitely not a like formal thing. So let's just have a chat. All right. So let's talk about usable security beyond end users. So maybe like coming up on 25 years ago now, and a little longer than that, but sort of there was a prevailing attitude sort of among security professionals, which was sort of like, what is wrong with these users? Like, why can't our users get it right? Like, why don't they just memorize 50 unique, completely strong passwords all the time and never write them down and never share them with anybody, and then we wouldn't have any of these security problems. What is wrong with these users? And lots of like really smart people from sort of the foundations of the usable security as a discipline, slowly sort of change the perception of this around from what is wrong with these users to how can we make security more usable for people? Like instead of asking people to do impossible stuff, maybe we can make it a little easier for them. And so which is sort of where this talk comes in a little bit, because this is great, but and it's a huge improvement over where we were, but it's not enough, because we have a lot of, in security, we have a lot of systemic problems, and it's hard to solve them with individual solutions, right? Even if we make doing security as easy as possible for every individual user, we're still asking people to do a lot of work here. Even if you, right, like let's say, privacy policies are one of these things that comes up all the time, right? So there's a study from when I was a baby grad student that some folks at CMU wrote, which basically said that if you wanted to read all the privacy policies for the websites you encountered, this is back in like 2009, it would actually take you more than a year to read the policies of all the websites you encountered in 1 year. So you could literally do nothing but read privacy policies for 24 hours a day, and you still wouldn't be able to do it. So people have made a lot of effort to like, let's make privacy policies more readable. Let's maybe build some tools to help you read them for them. But even if you make these policies better, still asking people to make individual decisions about whether privacy is sufficient on every website they build, even if you make this the easiest possible decision in the world, this is still too much to ask people to do. And so we need to think a little harder about how we can, take some of these burdens away from people. And specifically, we need to move them away from end users and to other places in the security and privacy ecosystem that have more leverage, where a smaller change can make a bigger impact. And so we need to figure out what are those places, where are the places where we can have more impact in this way. And a lot of the work my group has been doing over the past few years is trying to find some of these places, trying to figure out what they are and see if we can find ways to have some leverage on trying to shift some of this burden away from end users. So, another example is that users should keep their software updated. Like, this is absolutely true. Everybody should keep their software updated all the time to avoid having certain kinds of security problems. Who here has ever not taken a software update on time because you didn't feel like restarting your computer right then, right? Okay, many of you are lying. I don't believe you, but
right now.
there you go. So So, but updates are annoying and people don't always remember to do them and sometimes they break stuff. So maybe we could just need fewer updates like in the first place. Maybe we could find these bugs a little faster before they get exploited. Because even if you update your software sort of relatively frequently, there's still this sort of window where bugs get exploited before the updates come out, all these kinds of things. And so I have two studies here. One is sort of about the adoption of Rust. So maybe we could have fewer bugs to start with if we used a more safe programming language. And one is about bug bounty programs, which are ways that we look for bugs, that we try to use the power of crowdsourcing to look for bugs. So I'm going to talk about both of those. We also say users should practice good password management. Again, this is true. It's choosing bad passwords is not a great idea. I don't recommend it. But on the other hand, you're not actually in charge of what happens at the services that you subscribe to, and sometimes they lose your password for you, and it doesn't really matter how good your password was. If the service lost your password, game over. So, then the next study that I'll sort of talk about is one we looked at for how security operations teams respond to incidents. For example, incidents of password stealing, to look at sort of some of the tools they use and whether or not they work. And then finally, right, so I was talking about this, lots of good privacy choices. That you should make good privacy choices all the time, but it turns out you would have to do nothing else all day but make good privacy choices, and that's pretty hard. So one thing we thought about that maybe could help was if we sort of outsourced making privacy choices a little bit. Like, it turns out if you want to buy, if you need to buy a dishwasher or a refrigerator and you want to buy a good one, you don't actually necessarily sit there and become educated on all the specs of what makes a good refrigerator, right? Like, there are plenty of, my refrigerator came with lots of numbers attached to it. I don't know what any of them mean, right? What do? Well, I go visit Consumer Reports, or maybe I go visit the Wirecutter, and they tell me, buy that fridge. And that's what I do, right? And maybe we can apply some of this in a security context as well. So that's the final study that I'll talk about if we get far. All right, so first, this study, which was conducted by my former PhD student, who is now a professor at Colorado School of Mines, about the benefits and drawbacks of adopting a secure programming language with Rust as a case study. So why do we pick Rust? Well, it turns out memory safety vulnerabilities are still a major problem. So somehow, even though we've known about these things since the late 80s, we still can't seem to get rid of them. And this is kind of a fun thing that this chart here is sort of all the bugs that were found in Chrome in one particular year, I think a couple of years ago. And you can see that use after free, the blue ones are memory bugs. The red ones are other memory unsafety, that's also memory bugs, and a couple of other things. So we still have these, they're still a big problem. And honestly, they're not going away until we get rid of C and C++. There are some arguments that, we could just get better at writing more secure C and C++. We've been trying that for a while, it hasn't really worked. So we picked Rust as sort of our guinea pig here, because it's attempting to kind of provide this nice security and performance trade-off point where you could theoretically use it as a replacement for C and C++ in many kinds of applications. But, how does that actually work when you want to try it? So we wanted to understand, what does adoption of Rust actually look like when companies try and adopt it? And what benefits do they get from it? So, if you do try and adopt it, does it work out for you? And then what are the big challenges in place to being able to switch over to this safer language? And to do this, we conducted 16 interviews with senior developers at companies that had some kind of project that switched over to Rust or attempted to switch over to Rust. And then we also conducted a survey with about 178 members of the Rust community. So these are people who, are pretty close to Rust, so they hang out in a Rust subreddit or they contribute to Rust documentation. So these are kind of people who like Rust, but we still wanted to understand sort of what their perspective was on this. And so what did we find out? So the first thing is that, pretty much universally, everybody said the big problem with Rust is it's really hard to learn. Anybody here tried learning Rust lately? No, I saw at least one person nodding over there. It's, okay, but learning new programming languages is always hard, but well, our participants said this is, significantly harder than learning other kinds of programming languages because it's a really big paradigm shift in the way that you do the programming. And this is a quote from one of our participants. They said it has a near vertical learning curve. On the other hand, it does have some things to help with this. So Rust is sort of known for having really nice error messages, not kind of obscure ones. So they actually will tell you something useful about what went wrong. So that's a plus. We also had our participants report that the official documentation was pretty good. So it's helpful when you get stuck. And that the community is pretty helpful too. So if you are stuck, you can sort of ask for help in the Rust community and get some. So the learning curve is hard, but there are some resources out there to help you. In terms of the benefits that we saw, our participants reporting that they had just much improved confidence in their code correctness. And many of them also reported sort of an increase in longer term productivity. So what they told us is they're spending way more time sort of initially developing the product, but then just spectacularly less time testing it and fixing it and going through updates and iterations of it at the back end. And so it felt like it was taking much longer, but then when you added up all those pieces together, it was actually taking less time. So they felt that in the end, at the beginning, they didn't feel that way, but in the end, they felt that it did improve their productivity. They also said that it had some knock-on effects of actually teaching them how to write safer code in other languages after spending time with Rust. So this is maybe my favorite quote from like any study I've done in the last 5 years, which is sort of, once you learn Rust, you are one with the borrow checker. It never leaves you. So now I see many of the unsafe things I've been doing in other languages for years, but probably not all of them because I'm a human and not a compiler. So learning to shift your thinking into this Rust style paradigm is actually helpful, even when writing code in other languages going forward. On the other hand, this is not all roses and unicorns around here. There are also a lot of challenges. So in addition to this steep learning curve that we already talked about, our participants expressed a lot of concern about sort of maturity and maintenance over the long term. So if you're going to invest all this time in switching over to using Rust, is it still going to be there in 10 years, right? Like at this point, we can feel fairly confident that like C is not going to sort of vanish, right? It might be nice if it did, but it's been here for a while and it's going to be here for longer. But is Rust, going to continue to be updated? Are people going to continue to contribute libraries to it? Is it going to continue to be useful? People also expressed a lot of concern about hiring Rust developers. Not a lot of us are teaching our university students to code in Rust, right? This is not a thing that people necessarily have a lot of experience with. So they're worried, like, what if we switch our code base over here and then now we can't hire anybody to work on our code base again going forward in the future. And this sort of gets at the general theme, which is all of these benefits happen in the longer term. And all of these costs and commitments happen upfront, right? You're sort of gonna make this switch, which is gonna make life difficult for you. And you're kind of banking on the fact that it's gonna work out eventually in the end. And this is the kind of thing that companies don't love to do, right? This is not, making this kind of upfront investment and hoping that it's gonna sort of work out for these longer term benefits, that's a challenging proposition. So our participants had some suggestions to like, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, just a quick question. So you interviewed some people who were already in industry doing it. Did you ask them why they chose to do that in the first place?
Yeah, and they mostly chose it for the security benefits, basically. They wanted to get to those kinds of security benefits, and they usually what starts with sort of 1 or 2 champions from somewhere inside the company, and they sort of slowly get it to be adopted for like one feature or one small piece of the software, and then they kind of evangelize it. Look how helpful it's being over here in this corner of the company, and then they can try to spread it to other parts of the company, which is sort of the suggestion that they gave us for how to sort of, their suggestion for how to overcome some of this initial inertia was to sort of start small and try to, demonstrate the value of the thing.
Follow up. Do you have any survey that says how many of the what's the percentage of the company that uses this language?
So for our participants from the interview, I think it varied where some of them, the whole company was turned over, and some of them it was really only just one part of the software, the part that where the performance was most important. So the part that would have been the hardest to get away from C usually is sort of where they start. So some of the low level stack kind of things.
Question.
Yes,
I would like to ask a question from the pedagogical point of view.
okay,
We used to see, for example, in teaching operating systems, and the reason being that it use the low-level memory
Sure.
management. Then
absolutely.
we expose students to the memory bugs and things like that. Then we told them that you have Belgrade and other tools to help debug.
Mhm.
So if we switch to Rust, then they will never see those issues.
Mhm.
Then, which means that just like they program in Java or other high-level scripting languages, they will never see those issues. Is that good from the educational point of view, or I mean,
Right,
should we, okay, now we know that it's so important for the industry. Should we say, hey, let's forget about C, let's teach Rust?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's sort of pros and
what's the-
cons, right? I mean, I
Right,
think there is a lot to be said for sort of, you know, when you learn C, you do actually sort of have to learn how the memory is organized, and you have to learn, you know, that you can learn stuff about like how do you actually talk to the hardware. You can do some of that, you can do a little bit of that in Rust also, but so I think it does lose like a little bit of that lower level understanding, but at the same time, I think if we're only teaching, like it probably doesn't hurt to teach that some of the time, but I think if we're only teaching that, we're sort of setting folks up to fail a little bit, because we show them how to write code in C, and then we say, but just really be careful and don't have any buffer overflows. It turns out like that's really hard. So we're kind of setting people up to work, you know, and I do this too. I mean, I teach a security class, and we have a buffer overflow project, and it's fun, and everyone likes it, right? Like it's just fun to like exploit the stack in that way, right? Okay, maybe it's only fun for me because I'm a weird security person, I don't know, but like, and I find it frustrating, right, when the students come to my class who, you know, don't really understand things like the memory model, and so we have to sort of go back to the beginning and like, what is a stack, and teach it from the beginning. So I think there's definitely value in still, you know, learning these things, but I think if we're sending the students out in the world and just telling them, well, you know, it's fine to keep using C, but just be careful, we're sort of setting them up to fail in this way. So I'm not quite sure what the ideal sort of you know, balance is there, but yeah. Yes.
A potential solution could be use unsafe Rust to
Mhm.
demonstrate bugs.
Yeah, so this is actually another thing. So so this is sort of a quick summary because I wanted to put a bunch of studies in here, but unsafe code is a thing that came up in our study. So so Rust has this feature, I guess, where if you need to do something that doesn't work under the sort of secure memory model, you can declare a block of code to be unsafe, and it will let you sort of do regular C things that Rust wouldn't normally let you do. And so one interesting question is sort of, are people just getting fed up with trying to make the Rust compiler happy and then just putting all the code in an unsafe block so that it'll stop? So there's some interesting studies about this, and how are you going to do that? And so one of the things that we asked people about was how unsafe code was handled at their organizations. And this was definitely something that I think needs some work. So we found that most of the people we spoke to didn't have a real process or procedure in place for like reviewing the unsafe code or handling it, or determining what was allowed to be an unsafe code or not. And so this is kind of as Rust continues to mature, I think this is a place we need to go, is sort of building this stuff into software development models. Like we should, you know, sometimes you do need it. There are very occasionally things, right? Like certain kinds of things, you need mutexes, you kind of have to put in an unsafe block. But do you ever have to do that yourself, or can you use a library that already exists to do that? So we really need, you know, procedures aimed at not letting people kind of abuse that, which aren't quite in place yet, at least when we did the study. Yeah, and so the other things our participants suggested were sort of providing enthusiastic support. So basically, because this learning curve is so challenging, people are going to get really frustrated. And so if you want to be sort of the Rust champion at your organization, you have to be willing to kind of hang out in the trenches and help everybody sort of debug their code as long as it takes to be able to get past this sort of frustration thing and get past this learning curve. We also have another study, which isn't in this talk, where we sort of looked at, is it possible to kind of break Rust apart a little bit and try to teach different parts of the memory model in different ways? So like, what if you added a garbage collector? So you still have to worry about sort of, you still have to worry about like borrow checking and stuff, but you don't have to worry about making sure that the memory is sort of fully allocated, and so you give people sort of only half the things to learn at one time. And the answer is it kind of sort of worked, but we probably need to work on it a little more to really be convinced that it worked, but it maybe kind of worked. Anyway, so the upshot sort of from the study, and again, I threw a bunch of studies in here, so they're all just kind of like going by at light speed, but is that, you know, everybody we talked to, which again was sort of Rust enthusiasts, so we didn't talk necessarily to the people who had tried it and hated it, but the people who we spoke to, you know, really believe that the long-term benefits are real, but that, you know, that the community and support matter a lot because of this learning curve. And then because the startup costs are large and committing to this is really risky, it can be sort of hard to take a jump, and you really need a champion who's willing to kind of take a risk on these things. And so, you know, the question for people who are interested in this, for people who want to make it easier to write more secure code by making it easier to adopt this stuff, is how do we do this? How do we flatten this learning curve? And how do we reduce this upfront risk? Like, what could we do to support, you know, to help be more convincing that Rust or any of these, you know, memory safe languages, right? We picked Rust as an example, but there are other ones you can pick. What can we do to provide more confidence that this is going to be around for the long term and that libraries are going to continue to be supported? What could we do to ensure that there'll be a better supply of Rust developers out there for companies to hire to sort of reduce some of this uncertainty? So these are some of the, you know, I think future topics that we have to think about if we want to make it easier to actually transition to, you know, what I think actually we would be better off in many ways. So, yeah. Questions? So the second study I want to sort of briefly hit on is this paper from Usenix this year on bug hunters' perspectives on challenges and benefits of the bug bounty ecosystem. This was led by my PhD student, Omer, who's going to graduate in a couple of weeks, so that's exciting. So bug bounty programs, for folks who aren't familiar, is a sort of way of crowdsourcing your security analysis. And so what you do is, if you own a company that makes some software, you can create a bug bounty program in which you say, if you find a vulnerability in my program and you report it to me, I will pay you. And so you should report it to me so I can pay you instead of like selling it to the Russian government so that they'll pay you instead, right? Don't do that. Come to me and let me pay you. Okay, so great. So these things exist. And this is a you know, benefit to the company because they get to learn about their vulnerabilities a little sooner and hopefully before they're being actively exploited in the wild. The people who work on these programs, you know, at least in theory, they get some money and they get some recognition, and you know, they get to say that they found these bugs. So here's a picture from one that Verizon had. This is a while back, which is basically showing, you know, that it tells you a little bit about which parts of the system are in scope to find bugs for. And it tells you things like how long it takes them to pay you if you find a bug. So these bug bounty programs existed. And then shortly after that came along sort of bug bounty platforms. And a platform is just attempting to sort of organize bug bounty programs across multiple companies. And so these are things like HackerOne and BugCrowd. And what they do is they help connect bug bounty programs with hunters. And they're supposed to sort of standardize the process. And the idea is if you become a member of one of these platforms as a bug hunter, they will show you the list of all of the available programs where you can hunt for bugs and give you some information about them. And then you can sort of in a standardized way report the bugs that you find to any of those programs via the platform. So this is supposed to be sort of a standardized way of organizing these bug bounty programs. Yeah, so HackerOne and BugCrowd are two of the biggest players in this space. There are some others. So we were interested in this study in understanding bug hunters' perspectives on how these platforms and programs work. Because the whole thing only sort of works to the extent that there are people willing to go and look for bugs in programs and finding this to be like a useful thing for them to do. Otherwise, the bugs won't get found, right? So we wanted to understand, you know, what they're thinking. Under the theory that if you could get more effective bounty programs, you might be able to get better security. There's probably other ways you could do it, right? You could strengthen the security review teams inside individual companies as well. There's plenty of other things you could do, but this is maybe one place you could do it, is you could try to make the programs more effective. And so this also creates questions about, what do the hunters consider when they're choosing what to go after? And because, maybe sort of societally, it's really important that people look for vulnerabilities in like medical devices or big energy infrastructure or something. And if all of our bug hunters are, looking for like bugs in, I don't know, game apps for my phone, then this is maybe not the optimal like trade-off of how this could be, right? So it'd be good to kind of understand how this works and what is keeping people in or driving people out of these programs. So here, this was kind of a complicated study. We started with a free list survey in which we had 56 people who have worked as bug hunters in platforms, just basically list for us factors that they consider when deciding whether or not to participate in the program. We then had a follow-up survey in which we showed people every factor that anybody had listed in the initial survey and asked them to rank them. So the first one was kind of recall, and the second one is more like recognition and ranking. And then we also conducted 24 interviews from participants in both surveys to sort of ask them in more depth about their answers and sort of why they answered the way that they did. And our participants were quite diverse in self-rated skill and experience. So we had folks who had been hunting for bugs for, a long time, all the way down to folks who had been hunting for bugs for like 6 months and who rated themselves as everything from, very junior to very expert. So we found that sort of the key motivations of the bug hunters, well, the first one is not too shocking, which is money. Nobody, we were sort of expecting that, but it turns out that it's a little more complicated maybe because figuring out which program pays the best is actually not necessarily straightforward, because some programs pay really well for the top vulnerabilities, but don't pay very much for like less important ones. Other programs maybe have a more balanced, it's more money throughout the table. And so we saw some hunters were like confident that they could find a really high value thing, and so they only worry about the top value. And other folks didn't think they would be able to do that, and so they worry about the value sort of down through the table. Kind of a theme that you're going to see here is that we didn't find like a consistent set of these are always the things that people care the most about, but we found sort of different flavors of things, often related to sort of amount of experience, that will govern sort of the way that people pick these things. A second really strong motivation was learning opportunities. So joining one of these platforms gets you access, for example, to seeing public reports that have already been filed against this program and learning from them. And we also found that that our participants rated the community as quite helpful, which was a little bit surprising because in some sense, all the bug hunters are competing against each other. So it's somewhat surprising that they rated the community as like a very helpful way of learning things, but they did. Many of these programs are sort of organized around this idea that reputation is a big deal. And so they will like give you big shiny stars and points and, write your name bigger because like you are awesome and you found more bugs than somebody else. And we found out that our participants really didn't rate that very highly. Like they didn't actually, there's this sort of maybe leftover idea from like earlier versions of hacking and security vulnerabilities that like hackers are out here for the glory, right? They're out here to like write, Bob was here on your website kind of thing. But this is not maybe true anymore. They were much more interested in both money and skill building. Some of the biggest challenges that we found relate to communication. So things like an unclear scope of the program. So basically the hunter not being able to tell what was in and out of scope. And then you find a vulnerability and you go report it and you get told, oh, we're not going to pay you for that because it was out of scope. Similarly, they had a lot of dissatisfaction with their responses. So basically what happens as a bug hunter is you find a vulnerability, you write a report about it and you throw it over the wall. And then you wait for some arbitrary amount of time for somebody to come back and tell you whether or not it was a real vulnerability, whether somebody else found it first, whether you're really going to get paid for it, how much you're going to get paid for it. And so, they also had a lot of problems where, they submitted a vulnerability and then they heard back that it wasn't one because there was some misunderstanding in what they described and how the managers sort of understood what it meant, which could be about the reports being poorly written, or it could be about the managers not understanding enough about, the vulnerability to be able to parse it, right? It could be about a lot of things, but either way, there's sort of a communications breakdown in there. And then we had some participants sort of believing that the managers were sort of not operating in good faith, right? That I'm gonna tell you about this vulnerability and then you're gonna go fix it, and then you're gonna come back and tell me, oh, we already fixed that independently, so I don't have to pay you for it. So this, whether or not this is really happening is not totally clear, but there was enough ambiguity in this communications process that it left room for these hunters to, really feel paranoid and feel that they were not being dealt with in good faith here. And one of the jobs in theory of the platforms is to act as mediators between the individual companies and the hunters. And we found that the hunters really didn't feel like that helped very much, and that they felt that the platforms sort of were incentivized to keep the companies happy so that they would stay on the platform, and so the mediation didn't feel that it was, fair, was being handled neutrally or fairly. Whether, again, it's sort of hard to know what's real and what's the perception of the people, but this is the way it feels to the hunters. On the other hand, they did feel that platforms did provide some value. So one thing is that they made it easy to get paid in multiple currencies, right? So wherever you are in the world, a platform sort of enables you to get paid, even if the company that's paying you doesn't necessarily know how to pay you in your local currency or with your local banking system. They did like the idea of sort of standardizing the way bugs were reported across all of these different programs, even though the reporting still doesn't quite work as well as it could. And they really appreciated the ability to view prior reports as part of learning and gaining more skills. On the other hand, bug hunting is really gig work. And so it has many of the same kinds of pros and cons that other kinds of gig work have, which is, it has flexibility, you can do it when you want to do it, but it also has a ton of uncertainty. You're going to spend a lot of time looking for these bugs, and maybe you're going to find one or maybe you're not. And if you find it, you may or may not get credit for it. Somebody else might find it first. It may turn out not to be an ego. And so what we found was that a lot of people, said that they were keeping their day job basically because they didn't feel comfortable sort of taking a risk on this kind of gig work thing. And so if we really want and I don't have it in here, but we also have some stuff around the biggest companies that have the most practice administrating programs are the easiest to deal with. And as a result, the hunters all sort of flock to the same small set of companies, and the other companies don't really get as much traffic off of the platforms. And so, again, some of the ones that are smaller and don't get as much traffic are the ones that you might think of as societally critical infrastructure. So there's potentially, imbalances in there that we should worry about. So how could we potentially try to make this work a little better? Well, we could work on improving the communications process. And platforms maybe have a role here to help smaller companies by, giving them some training as to how to interpret these reports, or maybe providing additional, interpretation or mediation services. Also giving more training to the bug hunters for how to submit a high quality report that's going to be more likely to be accepted. It certainly would be nice to sort of reduce the uncertainty process. So that, and so try to move it sort of away from this gig work model into more of an effort-based payment model instead of only a success-based payment model. You have to think a little bit about what that would look like, but you could imagine variations on that where, the companies pay into the platforms, and the platforms have some kind of insurance for hunters based on based on time spent. You'd have to figure out a way to verify it and stuff. It would not be easy, but it's potentially possible to do that. It also is potentially possible, if we think that bug bounty programs are a useful part of this overall security ecosystem, then we should think more about how to support companies that don't currently have them that would benefit from them. So maybe there could be, maybe you could get a small grant from the government to help you set up your first bug bounty program or something along those lines, especially for, societally critical infrastructure. Yes.
So when you do this study, do you know the different commissions that different platforms will take between the hunter and the company?
I don't. I suspect that my grad student does, but I, off the top of my head, don't remember what that was.
Okay,
So,
to me that this is similar to many other business like renting apartments. So there are different platforms for renting apartment.
right.
So you have an apartment to rent. I will advertise to many agencies and then they find the renters.
Yes.
So how you compare those business models with this particular?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what the platforms are doing, right? The platform's business model is that they are providing value by sort of centrally managing these things instead of requiring the companies to each manage their own program. So the value proposition to the companies is that the platform manages it, and to the bug hunters is that they can sort of one-stop shop for programs. So, but it has, you know, like you would think, it has sort of a bunch of the pros and cons of, you know, like middlemen services in plenty of other businesses, right? Like they are taking a cut off the top to do this management, and at least at the moment, they are providing some benefits, but also maybe not doing as much as they could to actually help smooth out this process between the two other sides. So.
And also, is there a platform that try to organize hunters to make stronger teams?
So there are many like community groups, but I don't think we've seen anything resembling like a union yet. But I feel like, you know, that is something you could imagine going in that direction in the future. But at the moment, it's more like informal community support type groups.
Because also I can see that if people seeing that they can kind of forming a union, in a few years, they can have a spin-off companies to
Right.
make their own, so they can advertise as itself to then
Yeah.
to become independent, right? So
Yeah, so that they wouldn't, yeah, I mean, I think,
they don't have to go through this intermediary.
yeah, I mean, I think we're still just really early in this entire process. And so you could imagine something like that. And I mean, there are, you know, instead of putting your software on a bug bounty platform, you couldn't just hire a penetration testing company to do the same thing, right? So that's kind of, so you can hire a pen testing company directly instead. That's usually more expensive.
So along those lines, do you have any sort of guesstimates of how much people actually make, like on an hourly basis?
I mean, it ranged, you know, we had people who basically did not make, you know, made nothing, you know, to a first approximation. And there are people who are pulling in, you know, hundreds of $1,000s a year doing this work. But it's very much, you know, the shape of the curve is what you would think it is, right? It's like a bunch of people out here not making much money and then a small number of people out here making
Actors.
Yeah, so it's, yeah, it works
A
like that.
follow up to this, just like if I were successful in few discoveries, then I can hire poor graduate student to help me out, right? So can
Yes, you can, yeah, and,
then form the company or form my own union to.
right. Yeah, and some of the programs actually are sort of invite only. So you have to have successfully found some number of bugs previously to be able to be invited to go to some of these other high value programs. So there's a lot of labor organizing dynamics in there, right? Like there's an interesting study from some like sociology professors around this too, right? So like there's a ton of interesting labor market dynamics here as well that are, you know, because it's this whole thing. Yes.
So far you've talked about for-profit. I'm wondering how this impacts like open source projects.
Yeah, I think this is a thing where, you know, open source projects don't always have the money to pay for this kind of thing. So then the argument becomes, well, you know, so people are willing to commit to open source projects sort of for free or for token amounts of things. So are people also willing to hunt for bugs for open source projects kind of for free? Not totally clear. Or even just like nonprofits, or, you know, one of the examples it's in the paper, I think, is that like there was some, I want to say some electric company that tried to have a bug bounty program and it sort of went nowhere because they offered very little money and it was poorly organized. And like, actually, if you were asking me which of the things I would most like to see have a successful bug bounty program, like the electric infrastructure is sort of high up there on the list, right? But they don't really have the personnel or the money to like make that really happen. And so like, you know, there's definitely this sort of rich get richer element to this entire thing, right? Like everybody wants to find bugs for Google because Google is well organized and they pay well. But which, you know, nothing is good, but also like it creates, again, the curve is what you think it is. It's a small number of people and companies that are getting most of the benefit out of this ecosystem. So.
So, as cybersecurity researcher, every time when we submit a bug report, we have to spend a lot of time to writing the report so that they can understand it's indeed a vulnerability. And most of the time they cannot. And at the same time, we have to be very careful about the ethical issues when we demonstrate it is exploitable.
Yeah.
So are these ethical issues also a concern for this bug hunters or maybe?
Yeah, I mean, I think this comes down to, they have a lot of problems in the communication, and it can be, they spend a lot of time writing the reports, and then the reports get misunderstood. And again, it's sort of a little unclear, it's probably some of both, whether it's because the bug hunters have like great vulnerability hunting skills, but maybe they don't have great like writing and communicating skills necessarily, right? It's also unclear whether the managers on the other side have the training to understand some of these pretty subtle vulnerabilities that happen, even when you sort of try to explain to them. There's also, right, this idea of like, how are you ethically going to demonstrate that this thing is exploitable? The programs some of them have safe harbor rules that come with them, and others not so much, which was a mid-level concern. So some of our participants were worried about the safe harbor more than sort of others. Yeah, but I think this is a huge, this is one of the things that our participants would like the platforms to get better at, is to support a lot of this communication process and make it easier once you find the bug to actually go through that process. Which I think is sort of non-trivial to do, but is one of the things that I think would add some value. Okay. So the third study I want to talk about briefly relates to assessing the usability of incident response playbooks. And this was also led by a former student of mine. Okay, so what is a playbook? A playbook is a step-by-step guide for incident response. And these things exist in a bunch of different industries. So if you're an airplane pilot and something goes wrong on your plane, what you're not supposed to do is sort of sit there and think for a bit about like, how should you solve this problem on your airplane? What you're supposed to do is sort of follow a well-defined procedure, which maybe you have memorized, or maybe you look it up in the book, and it's sort of a step-by-step, right? And so people have tried to apply this this process to cybersecurity incidents. And the idea is, I'm a security operations person, I'm working in my security operations center, and something goes wrong, something bad happens. Instead of having to like think and problem solve how to react to it, I should be able to read out of my playbook the correct way to respond to this incident, that we prepared ahead of time, so that it can happen smoothly and quickly and without, a lot of panicking, right? So these things exist and are sort of in increasing adoption in industry and government places. And then because playbooks exist, the next thing that sort of existed is something called a playbook framework, which is guidelines for creating a playbook at your organization, right? Because these things, have to be created, and how are you going to build one? So we have frameworks that are designed to help you build a playbook for your own organization. And these things are sort of being increasingly recommended by some of the government agencies that do a lot of cybersecurity work. And what we realized is that these things are being recommended and to some extent being adopted. And as far as we were aware, nobody had ever tried to figure out whether or not they work. So that was kind of our thinking was like, maybe we should find out whether they work a little bit, possibly. So so we did this very, very, very early first cut study, right, far from the final word, which had sort of two parts. And in the first part, we brought a bunch of people in, and we had them design playbooks using these established playbook frameworks to see what they came up with, and whether the frameworks were actually helping them to do a good job of making playbooks or not. And then in the second study, we took sort of a couple of the best playbooks that were written. So these playbooks are all sort of organization specific. So we recruited people from two organizations, and then one of the organizations very generously allowed us to they adopted two of the best playbooks that were written during study one, and then they allowed us to sort of conduct some no-notice live exercises in which the bad thing happened, and we got to find out whether or not the security operators were able to sort of use the playbook and do the thing, which is a lot of fun. It turns out Rock, my grad student who was responsible for this one, has an amazing ability to talk anybody into anything, which turns out to be really handy when you want to do studies like this. Okay, so for study one, these were small because it turns out the population of people you can convince to do these things is relatively low. But it's sort of a first cut. So we had 12 security professionals. They each made 2 playbooks, one each with a NIST framework and one from the IACD, which is, oh no, all right, I forgot what IACD stands for, but I can look it up later. And we gave them 2 authentication scenarios. So they each sort of randomized the order and which one went with which. And they each sort of made a NIST playbook for one of the authentication scenarios and an IACD playbook for the other scenario. And then we had 3 expert evaluators take a look at the playbooks they came up with and tell us whether or not they thought they did a good job. And the main results were, our participants thought that the playbook frameworks were easy to learn. They enjoyed using them. On the other hand, they didn't appear to actually produce sufficient playbooks. So, and in particular, the experts found that, some of the key problems were that the guidelines were sort of working people towards linear paths. And in most cases, like sort of a linear path may not be sufficient. What you actually want is more like a flow chart, right? You want a chart of this bad thing happens, okay, is X or Y, and now we're gonna go over here and do that. And so the frameworks were not really moving people towards making these kinds of structured decision paths. The frameworks also were not pushing people towards detailed steps. So we ended up with a lot of playbooks that said things like, check whether any other machines are compromised, which, true, but like also not maybe helpful if what you're trying to do is like not have to think about how to do this thing and you just want to quickly go through it step by step, right? So a lot of these things, were too high level, and there weren't a lot of examples. And so people were sort of trying to generate these playbooks with these kind of high level frameworks, and they were getting high level outputs that were not really sufficient. So then in study 2, the organization, one of the organizations did take sort of 2 of the playbooks and put them into use. And then we went through these no notice exercises. And it's important to note, like, a whole lot of thought and effort went into how to do this carefully. So we did make sure that even though they were no notice, they did come with the alerts that said like exercise on them, which is in this particular context of our organization that we worked with is a thing that happens a lot. So they understood that this was a test, but it was not a actual real live attack, which is important. We also worked carefully with the personnel at the organization to pick times to run these exercises that were considered low risk times, right? Because we're taking security operators away from their actual jobs. So not times when, half the personnel were on vacation, not times when some particularly important thing was going on. And things like this. So we worked with them, carefully to set up things doing this. And in the end, there were 5 personnel who responded to these incidents. There were 3 incidents and 5 personnel who responded to them over the course of time. And our first round was a complete failure. So the experienced operator found the thing completely unuseful. He's like, no, I already know what to do. I don't need to look at this. Again, the playbook was still sort of a little too high level. He's like, I don't need to look at this playbook. I already know what to do. On the other hand, and it was sort of hard to use it under stress. Basically, the experienced operator said, like, I would rather just do the things I know how to do instead of looking at this playbook under stress. On the other hand, our novice operator did not realize that they should use the playbook because they actually missed recognizing the beginning of the incident in the first place. So our novice operator never actually opened the playbook to try to use it to respond to the incident at all, which maybe doesn't tell us very much about the content of the playbook, but does sort of point at sort of a key structural weakness in this entire idea, right? And so we had 2 rounds of this that went sort of the same way. In which they just our experienced people didn't need it and our novice people missed it entirely. So then we said, okay, let's reset a little bit here. And so Rock, my PhD student, worked with the organization personnel and went through sort of a mentoring and coaching process. So they spent a lot more time digging into training their novice operators on these playbooks. They went through tabletop exercises. They went through and refined them and added a lot more layers of detail. They added an easier things that seem obvious in retrospect. They added an easier table of contents system to be able to find the correct part of the playbook for the type of incident that you're having, which again, in retrospect seems kind of obvious, but turns out to be a thing that wasn't in there originally. And when they did, and they went through that process, and then, an actually newly onboarded operator who was trained with the updated playbooks actually recognized the incident and went to the playbook and was able to use it successfully to resolve the thing. So, this is a very small case study, right? I'm not trying to say that our experience of 3 people sort of generalizes to everybody, but I think we learned some good stuff, which is that, if you can't get people to recognize that the attack is happening, then the playbook is unhelpful. So these are the things, we really have to train on and work through with people. And we need our playbooks themselves to have a higher level of detail and to be sort of structured as flowcharts instead of as linear things. And our frameworks are not currently supporting that. And so the frameworks really need to be improved to enable better playbooks. We also need some examples, right? So the examples that exist out there were not too great. And it's possible that, even though a playbook will have to be customized to an organization, we can benefit a lot from sharing these things to different organizations, even if you have to customize it a little bit. And what we found in our sort of case study is that, it required training and mentoring and rehearsal to really institutionalize the use of the playbooks in order to make this work. And again, this is sort of, in security, we like to learn everything for the first time as though nobody has ever done these things before. Airline pilots are not looking at the playbook for the first time when something goes wrong on the plane, right? They get trained on these things. There's a lot of training that goes into this. These things are institutionalized. And for some reason in security, we just cowboy everything in this way. But actually, it would be better if we adopted some of these institutionalizing practices. Okay, and so that's it for that one. Questions? Yes.
Is there a software system that try to mechanicalize all these steps?
There are lots of tools that are intended to help you recognize and respond to attacks of various kinds. But I think they're just not all the way there yet. They're definitely, many of them at least are more helpful than not. Some of them are probably just junk, but many of them are more helpful than not having them. But it's still, doing security operations is still much more of an art than a science. And maybe that won't always be true, I hope not, but at least for the moment, it is a very artisanal thing. People learn it in on-the-job training, and then they are capable of doing it because they have experience. And so we don't yet have the kinds of automated tools that can really do this work. Maybe we'll get some, right? ChatGPT is coming to save us all and solve all of our problems. So, maybe we'll get some, but we're still, I think, a little far from having these things that, work sort of totally independently.
Because I was trying to draw the analogy from software engineering. So now is there a secure engineering with developing tools to help at least address some popular incidents?
Yeah, there definitely are. I think part of it is that there's a lot of companies that make these tools. A lot of the tools are not necessarily very well vetted, and so it's not totally clear. They're being purchased maybe by people who don't totally understand what they're for, and so there's a lot of snake oil out there. There's also useful tools, and so I think there's just a bunch of, we see this over and over when we talk to security operators that tools exist, but they don't always have the right ones, and sometimes they get, sometimes somebody in higher level management sees a shiny thing and it's ooh, I want that one, but it maybe doesn't fit with their organization and all of, none of these are shocking problems, right? But
Just go back to your big things, the usability issue. If it's not useful or
right, exactly,
user friendly, then
it doesn't sort of work. Yeah, so I think this is part of, we have a lot of these kinds of things in security, which are sort of tools that work, at least when you test them in controlled environments, but they don't always work for people in real life situations. And I think we're still sort of a long way from scientizing this process in a way that sort of could do better on those things. And so I think there's just I mean, there's just 9 million places you could try to improve this ecosystem, right? So this is just one we were interested in and we looked at it, but there's just an infinite number of places you could try to improve this ecosystem, which is just totally haphazard at the moment. How are we doing on time here?
5 more minutes.
5 more minutes? Okay, so I have one more study, which I probably don't have time to talk about in detail, but this one is about product reviewers. So again, this is, the idea that like we're asking people to, go buy like smart toasters and decide whether or not this is a good product for them to have in their home. And people are not really equipped to make these decisions. And so we were curious whether you could, offload some of this work onto people who are already reviewing products. We didn't know, maybe not, right? So for purposes of this study, we think of product reviewers as professionals who evaluate internet connected devices as part of their job. So this includes, people who write for magazines or internet websites, also people who have YouTube video channels that are about product reviewing and similar kinds of things. Our participants had a wide range of experience in security and privacy. We had folks from nonprofits, from for-profit publishers, from video channels, independent YouTubers. These logos are up here as examples of things you might have heard of that do this type of work. Should not be interpreted as the idea that our participants did or did not come from any of these 3 organizations, but just to give you an idea of the type of thing we're talking about. So we asked them, what security and privacy criteria, if any, do they use when they're evaluating products? Do they use any tools or techniques to help them figure out about security or privacy? And how do they think of the incentives and responsibilities around this? Do they think of this as part of their job? So we interviewed 17, actually technically 18 product reviewers, two of whom sort of review as a team. And so we interviewed them together as a team as well. And with a wide range of experience and organizational size. So we had people, independent people who had their own YouTube channel, all the way up to people who worked at very large organizations that employ lots of people who do these kinds of work. And everybody had to have reviewed at least 10 products in sort of a professional way. So first, okay. So we asked them sort of about the security and privacy criteria they use, and basically everybody was interested in sort of data collection and sharing, but after that there was like much less. So there were a bunch of things that a couple people mentioned around like deletion and retention and other things, but like software updates, whether a device can take software updates or not, which is actually a pretty important security feature. It's down here in the bottom with just like two of our participants even mentioned it. So, a lot of questions about data protection and not so much about other kinds of security. The incentives for evaluating security and privacy are kind of mixed. On the one hand, it would be bad to like recommend some product to everybody and then 2 weeks later there's a giant breach and it turns out this product was terrible and you have some egg on your face, right? So there is some incentive to not screw this up. But on the other hand, and also some folks said that like security and privacy information was appealing to particular audiences. So younger demographics, people with children. So this, like how secure is my baby monitor is actually like an interesting question that people are interested in, right? On the other hand, security, discussions don't get a lot of eyeballs. They're not very popular, so I don't have a big incentive to write about this in my reviews. And another sort of interesting thing that happens is that product reviewers in general don't have a lot of incentives to give negative reviews to things, because then companies get mad at this. So they sort of look at it as, if I don't like a product, I'm just not going to review it at all. And so this creates sort of an interesting thing on security. Like if they think that the privacy is just really bad, maybe they just won't review the product at all, but that leaves kind of like still some information for you for folks. We also found that our product reviewers were making some assumptions, some of which were more well-founded than others. So they were thinking about stuff like if somebody's just trying to guess your password, but they weren't thinking about sort of more complicated types of authentication problems that could happen, which again, that's not really their job. So, it's very understandable. We also had some folks making assumptions like, HomeKit from Apple is inherently secure because stuff runs locally and nothing has to go out to the cloud, and therefore, I can always recommend HomeKit products with a clear conscience because I always believe that they're going to be private. This turns out to be sort of not completely unfounded, but also not totally true either, right? So there are some HomeKit products that run in this kind of local only mode, but not all of them. It's a little more complicated than that, but kind of where they're coming from. They don't have a lot of time necessarily, they usually we usually spend, a day or two with a product before they're reviewing it. They were interested in, some tooling to help them make better decisions, right? So they have to figure out whether they think this thing is secure or private before they can recommend it to you. This is not so easy to do. They were interested in maybe some network monitoring tooling to figure out when data was leaving the local network or not. They were interested in better labels, especially about data use, and also, tools for reading privacy policies. So we did have several of our participants tell us that they try to read the privacy policy in order to make a good recommendation to their readers or their viewers, but privacy policies suck, so it's actually hard to do that, right? So tools to sort of help better read and understand privacy policies. IoT labeling is a big deal right now. Like NIST is going hard in this direction, right? There's a lot of problems with this idea, but people are trying to make it happen. And security and privacy labeling. And so our reviewers were interested, perhaps, maybe a product reviewer is going to be more able to read a more complicated label than an average consumer might be, perhaps. So there might be some room in there to improve things. But of course, their time and knowledge are limited. So, we did have sort of one of them tell us that they tried to use Wireshark to figure out what's going on in the network. And then they kind of gave up because actually it turns out this is pretty hard to do, right? And who has that kind of time? And if you're not an expert, this is, not an easy thing to do. So overall, we think that there's some mixed incentives in here, but there is maybe an opportunity to be helpful. Maybe by, trying to help product reviewers broaden their threat models a little bit. So things like botnets or misuse by legitimate users, and not just, a lot of our reviewers have this model of network bad guys only, right? Like hackers only, which is not necessarily always the threat model that you want. And they have these heuristics which can be useful but are not always valid. And it would be nice if we had some targeted tools or support to help these folks who are making recommendations, right? Like if the wire cutter recommends a product, it's that has good or bad security properties, it's going to have a huge impact on the overall security and privacy posture of people, right? That's just how it works. That's sort of how these things work. So there's a really unique opportunity in here if we can make it a little easier for these folks. Again, this is not their job. They're not trained to do this, but if we can make it a little easier for them to help, maybe they can help. Okay. So just to finish up, I hope I've sort of convinced you that professionals matter and not just end users. We have to think of ways to kind of shift this burden of security off of the end users, but professionals are also people and they need usability too. We can't just assume that just because somebody, is an expert at their job, that they also can handle the security and privacy aspects of it. And as a result, we really need to look at these kinds of professionals as a user base that we need to support with more tooling, with more support for adoption, with more, to enable people to be able to, leverage these more systemic points to be able to improve security and privacy sort of for end users at better scale. And I guess that's it.
We will run out of time. We should have time maybe to take just 1 to 2 questions. Questions from our students or audience. So just one last question. When you interview those product reviewers, will they get files when they review those products based on these interviews?
Yeah, so I think this is a thing that, they had a lot of sensitivity about this, which is that they do feel a responsibility, to, give people reviews to their, they feel a responsibility to their readers or viewers to give them good information. But also, they write too many negative reviews, companies are not going to give them products to review them just because. So then this is the way that they kind of square this circle. Also, negative reviews are like less commonly read than positive reviews, so they don't get as much, they don't get as much page. So they kind of square this circle by just never writing negative reviews. So they don't write positive reviews of products they don't actually want to endorse, but they just don't write reviews of products. This is kind of unclear whether this is like, how this works out for consumers sort of in the end, but that's kind of how they square this circle where they have these. Yes.
This might have been outside of the scope of your study, but did you notice any differences between like older media versus like YouTube oriented? Like I guess like if it's like an individual doing like YouTube reviews versus like.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the older ones are also bigger, and so they just have more resources, right? Like if you can throw, a month and thousands of dollars and 5 people's time at thoroughly reviewing this product, or are you like, you need to review 1 product per day for your YouTube channel, it's just you, and you just do 1 per day for your YouTube channel to like, right? So I think there's a huge difference in the way that these things are resourced, and I think it matters a lot actually. So, the people from bigger places had much more well-defined, they weren't always doing it, but they had more well-defined thoughts and processes about how to think through security. At least, not always. Yes.
Do you know if anyone has done any analysis on whether most of the privacy policies are just boilerplate, where it's similar for like most services or products?
So, so there has been a ton of effort to use various kinds of NLP to parse privacy policies and pull out the most important pieces. And it turns out like a lot of it is boilerplate, but it's not always, and some of it is like in legalese. So actually like there's a version of this where you hire law students to annotate the privacy policies in order to train your model. And it turns out you can't even get the law students to agree on what the privacy policy says. So like, good luck training your model to agree, to figure out what it says, right? So like, you would think, but it turns out to be, it works. I mean, the most modern versions of these parsing tools work pretty okay, but they're not, they're not amazing, but they're pretty okay. So.
This is definitely outside the scope, but how often are they just straight up lying? Right?
Oh,
'Cause
about
having
what's in the privacy
and then
policy?
actually doing the thing.
Oh,
are
yeah,
completely different
so, a big piece here is that, I think they often lie sort of by accident because they don't actually know what their products are doing. So this IoT security and privacy labeling thing that's coming is like a big deal. And so NIST wants to make all the developers of these devices put labels on them about privacy and security. And it turns out, this is a study about this, that nobody working at these companies knows how to fill out these labels because they don't actually know what the answers are to many of these questions. Something similar happened, right? Apple started making all apps in the App Store put some kind of privacy label on like every app that you could download for your phone, and something similar happened where like a lot of them are wrong, and it's because developers don't actually know how to answer the questions, which is also a problem. So
that would actually be the good thing, right?
Right.
If they actually were
right,
wanting
if
to
they're
be
trying
honest,
to do it correctly and they just don't know. I mean, I think there's also there's bad actors, but in many cases. I think there's 2 flavors of things. There's the I didn't know how to do it correctly, or I don't actually know what my software does, so my privacy policy is incorrect. So we also see cases of like, for example, apps that import third-party ad libraries, and the ad libraries are doing all kinds of nefarious stuff, and the app developer doesn't even know what's happening. So like, I don't know how my app works, so I don't know whether it does this or not. The second sort of more common bad case, I think, is we're going to write our privacy policy to just kind of vaguely say, we can share any data we want with anybody we want for any reason, and then it will, we will never be lying because that's always kind of going to be true, right? But it's not really very helpful as a consumer trying to make a useful decision about what's happening, right? So I think those are more common than people sort of outright lying about these things. If you get caught sort of outright lying about it, the FTC will come and sue you. I mean, up to a point. If you're making any serious amount of money and you get caught kind of outright lying about these things, the FTC will come and give you a fine. So like, you're much better off sort of solving the problem by being you know, more lawyerly about it than actually just, you know, straight up lying and these kinds of things. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.